What happens when the hunter becomes the hunted? When those who believe they hold all the power discover they've walked straight into the crosshairs of death itself? Tonight, we dive into the fog-covered swamps of Georgia, where a group of slave hunters thought they were tracking easy prey, but instead found themselves face to face with the most lethal sniper the Union Army had ever produced. If stories of justice, survival, and incredible courage grip your soul, smash that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear will leave you speechless. The Georgia swamp breathed with a life of its own that October night in 1863. Spanish moss hung like ghostly curtains from ancient cypress trees, and the air was thick with moisture that seemed to cling to everything it touched. The moon, barely visible through the canopy of leaves and mist, cast pale silver streaks across the dark water that reflected like broken mirrors. 5 men moved through this primordial landscape with the confidence of predators who had never known fear. They were slave hunters, bounty men who made their living tracking down freedom seekers and dragging them back to the plantations that claimed to own them. Their leader, a scarred man named Jeremiah Colt, held a lantern that cast dancing shadows across his weathered face. Colt had been in this business for over 15 years, ever since he'd returned from the Mexican War with a bullet-shattered leg and a heart full of bitterness. The plantation owners paid well for his services, sometimes as much as $500 for a particularly valuable runaway. He had built a reputation as a man who never lost a trail, never came back empty-handed, and never showed mercy to those who dared to steal themselves from their rightful owners. "Tracks fresh," whispered Tommy Briggs, the youngest of the group, his voice barely audible above the symphony of crickets and tree frogs. He knelt beside a barely visible footprint in the soft earth, running his fingers along its edge. "Can't be more than an hour ahead." Tommy was barely 22. The son of a poor farmer who had joined Colt's crew 6 months ago when the war had made legitimate work scarce. He had a quick eye for tracking and an even quicker draw with his Colt Navy revolver. The older men treated him like a mascot, but Tommy was eager to prove himself worthy of their respect. Tonight, he hoped, would be his chance. Colt spat into the murky water beside him, the brown tobacco juice disappearing into the dark depths. "Good. Been tracking this one for 3 days. Plantation owners offering $200. Says this boy's got some special skills they need back." He chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. Special skills won't help him now. The plantation owner, Colonel Beauregard Ashford, had been particularly insistent about this particular runaway. The man they were hunting had been his personal blacksmith, capable of crafting everything from horseshoes to rifle barrels with remarkable precision. But more than that, Ashford suspected the runaway had been helping other slaves escape, using his position of relative trust to gather information and plan routes north. The third man, Marcus Webb, adjusted the rope coiled around his shoulder and checked his pistol for the 3rd time in an hour. "You sure it's just one man? Tracks seem deliberate, like he wants us to follow." Webb was a nervous man by nature, made more so by 3 years of hunting human beings through some of the most dangerous terrain in the South. He had seen what desperate people could do when cornered, had the scars to prove it. Something about this hunt felt different, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what. "Course he wants us to follow," sneered Pike Morrison, the largest of the group, his massive frame making the wooden walkway creak beneath his boots. "They always run to the swamp, thinking it'll hide 'em, but we know these waters better than any runaway." Pike stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed nearly 300 pounds, most of it muscle built from years of hard labor before he'd discovered that hunting men paid better than honest work. He carried a double-barreled shotgun that could drop a man at 50 yards. And he had never met a runaway who could stand up to him in a fair fight. Of course, Pike had never believed in fighting fair. The 5th man, Samuel Cross, remained silent as always. He was their tracker, a man who could follow a trail through hell itself. Cross had learned his skills hunting Seminoles in the Florida Everglades, where a single mistake could mean death by arrow or alligator. He had cold, pale eyes that seemed to see everything, and a thin mouth that rarely spoke unless he had something important to say. But tonight, something felt different. The usual signs of panic, of desperate flight, were absent. Instead, the footprints showed measured steps, careful placement, the gait of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Cross had seen tracks like these before, during the Seminole Wars, when he had been the one being hunted rather than doing the hunting. As they moved deeper into the swamp, the mist grew thicker, muffling their voices and making the world beyond their lantern light disappear entirely. The water lapped gently against the cypress knees, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out with a haunting cry that seemed to echo their own mortality. The swamp was alive, with sounds that spoke of ancient mysteries and hidden dangers. Alligators slipped through the water with barely a ripple, their eyes glowing like amber coals in the darkness. Snakes hung from branches like living ropes, and the very air seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of something vast and primordial. "There," Cross finally spoke, pointing ahead to where a faint orange glow flickered through the trees. "Campfire. 1/2 mile, maybe less." Colt's eyes gleamed with anticipation, the same look he got when he was about to collect a particularly large bounty. Perfect. Probably got himself a little camp, thinking he's safe. He turned to his men, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "We surround 'em quiet like. Take him alive if we can, dead if we can't. Either way, we're collecting that bounty tonight." The men began to spread out, each taking a position that would allow them to surround the distant campfire. They moved with the practiced efficiency of predators who had done this dance many times before. Tommy Briggs felt his heart racing with excitement, while Marcus Webb fought down the nervous flutter in his stomach. Pike Morrison cracked his knuckles in anticipation, and Samuel Cross simply melted into the shadows like smoke. But as they moved toward the distant fire, none of them noticed the figure that had been watching them from the shadows for the past hour. High in the branches of an ancient oak, perfectly still and nearly invisible against the bark, a man observed their every move through the scope of a rifle that had ended more Confederate lives than any other weapon in the Union Army. His name was Isaiah Freeman, though the soldiers who had served alongside him knew him simply as Ghost. At 32 years old, he had escaped slavery only to find himself in the middle of a war that would determine the fate of millions like him. The Union Army had given him a rifle and discovered they had unleashed something extraordinary, a man whose accuracy was so legendary that Confederate officers had put a $1,000 bounty on his head alone. Isaiah had been born on the very plantation from which he had escaped, the son of a woman who had died giving birth to him and a father he had never known. He had grown up in the slave quarters, learning early that survival meant being invisible, being useful, and never, ever showing the intelligence that burned behind his dark eyes. But the old master's son had seen something in the young slave and had taught him to read and write in secret, a kindness that would later save Isaiah's life when he needed to forge travel papers during his escape. That same young master had also taught him to shoot, taking him hunting in these very swamps, never imagining that he was training someone who would one day use those skills against everything the plantation system represented. Isaiah's dark eyes tracked the slave hunter's movements with the patience of a predator who had learned that survival meant thinking 3 steps ahead of death itself. His weathered hands, steady as stone, held the rifle that had spoken justice across a dozen battlefields. Tonight, it would speak again. The campfire the hunters had spotted wasn't his. It belonged to a family of refugees he had been guiding north, people who had trusted him to lead them to freedom. An elderly couple, their teenage daughter, and 2 young boys who still believed the world could be kind. They huddled around that small fire, unaware that death was walking toward them through the mist. But death would have to go through Isaiah Freeman first. As the slave hunters crept closer to their intended victims, Isaiah began his own hunt. He moved through the trees like smoke, each step calculated, each breath controlled. The war had taught him that sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was to become something terrible yourself. The mist swirled around him as he positioned himself for what was to come. In the distance, he could hear Colt's harsh whisper giving orders to his men. They were spreading out, preparing to surround the campfire, confident in their superior numbers and firepower. They had no idea they were walking into the crosshairs of the most dangerous man in the Georgia swamps. Isaiah checked his rifle one final time, feeling the familiar weight of the weapon that had become an extension of his very soul. The Springfield had been modified by Union armorers specifically for long-range work. The barrel had been carefully rifled for maximum accuracy. The trigger had been adjusted to a hair's breadth of sensitivity, and the scope had been crafted by the finest lens makers in Massachusetts. But the rifle was only as good as the man who wielded it, and Isaiah Freeman had been forged in fires that would have broken lesser men. Every shot he had taken in this war had been for freedom, his own, his people's, and the very soul of a nation that was finally ready to live up to its founding promises. Tonight, 5 more shots would ring out in the name of justice. The refugee family sat close together around their small fire, trying to draw warmth from flames that seemed to barely hold back the overwhelming darkness of the swamp. Martha Washington, not her real name, but the one she had chosen for herself when she decided to be free, stirred a thin soup made from roots and the last of their dried meat. Her husband Samuel kept his arm around their daughter Rebecca, while their 2 boys, David and little Thomas, dozed fitfully against his side. Martha was a woman of 43 who had spent most of her life in bondage on a rice plantation near Savannah. She had been separated from her first husband when he was sold to pay off gambling debts, and had watched 2 of her children disappear into the slave markets of Charleston before she was 25. The family around this fire represented everything she had left in the world, and she would die before she let anyone take them from her. Samuel Washington had been a carpenter on the same plantation, skilled enough that his master had hired him out to other plantations for extra income. It was during one of these jobs that he had met Martha, and they had been married in a simple ceremony in the slave quarters, knowing that their union had no legal standing, but meaning everything to them nonetheless. Their daughter Rebecca, now 16, had inherited her mother's fierce intelligence and her father's steady hands. She had been learning to read in secret, using a Bible that Martha had hidden beneath the floorboards of their cabin. The girl dreamed of becoming a teacher someday, of helping other freed slaves learn the letters and numbers that would give them power in the world beyond bondage. David, at 12, was old enough to understand the danger they were in, but young enough to still believe that good would triumph over evil. He had his father's build and his mother's eyes, and he watched the darkness beyond their fire with the alertness of someone who had learned early that safety was never guaranteed. Little Thomas, only 8 years old, still saw their journey as an adventure. He didn't fully understand why they had left the only home he had ever known, or why they had to travel at night and hide during the day. All he knew was that his family was together, and that the quiet man with the rifle had promised to keep them safe. "How much further, Mama?" Rebecca whispered, her voice carrying the exhaustion of 3 weeks on the run. Martha looked at her daughter's face, seeing the weariness there, but also the determination that had carried them this far. "Not much longer, baby girl," she replied, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "The man who's guiding us, he knows these swamps like the back of his hand. He'll get us to the Union lines." Samuel squeezed his daughter closer, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with being the man of the family in such desperate circumstances. "That man saved our lives back at the river crossing. If he says we're safe here tonight, Then we're safe. The river crossing Samuel referred to had been 3 days ago, when a Confederate patrol had nearly caught them fording a stream 20 miles south of their current position. Isaiah had appeared out of nowhere, materializing from the morning mist like an avenging angel, and had guided them to safety through a series of hidden channels and forgotten paths that only someone with intimate knowledge of the swamp could have known. But even as Samuel spoke the words of reassurance, he felt the weight of unease settling over the small camp. The swamp had grown too quiet, the natural sounds of night creatures fading to an ominous silence that made his skin crawl. He had spent enough time in these waters as a young man, hunting and fishing to supplement the meager rations provided by their master, to know when something was wrong. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks up into the misty air where they disappeared like dying stars. The soup Martha was stirring smelled of wild onions and cattail roots, flavored with a small piece of salt pork that Isaiah had shared with them from his own supplies. It wasn't much, but it was warm and filling, and it reminded them that they were still alive, still free, still moving toward a better future. 300 yards away, Jeremiah Colt and his men had taken their positions. They formed a loose circle around the campfire, each man hidden behind cypress trees and fallen logs, their weapons ready. Colt could see the silhouettes of the refugees clearly now, a family just as he had expected. Easy targets. Colt crouched behind a massive cypress root, his rifle trained on the campfire. He could make out individual figures now. An older woman stirring something over the fire, a man with his arm around what looked like a teenage girl, and at least 2 smaller shapes that had to be children. The sight filled him with satisfaction rather than any trace of human sympathy. Each person around that fire represented money in his pocket, and money was the only thing that mattered to Jeremiah Colt. "On my signal," he whispered into the darkness, knowing his men could hear him. "Remember, we want them alive if possible. Dead runaways don't bring bounties, but damaged goods still pay something." Tommy Briggs, positioned to the east of the camp, felt his heart racing with anticipation. This was only his 3rd hunt, and the excitement of the chase still thrilled him. He gripped his pistol tighter, imagining the praise he would receive when they dragged these fugitives back to civilization. In his young mind, he was performing a service to society, returning stolen property to its rightful owners. Tommy had grown up poor on a hardscrabble farm, where his family had barely scratched out a living from red clay soil that seemed to resist every attempt at cultivation. When Colt had offered him a chance to make more money in a month than his father made in a year, it had seemed like a gift from Providence. The fact that this money came from hunting human beings was something Tommy had learned to push to the back of his mind. Marcus Webb, crouched behind a fallen log, found himself thinking about the $200 they would split, enough to keep him in whiskey and cards for months. He had stopped thinking of their quarry as people long ago. They were just merchandise that had wandered off and needed to be returned to their rightful owners. Webb had been a soldier once, had fought in the Mexican War alongside Colt, but the things he had seen there had left him hollow inside. He drank to forget the faces of the men he had killed in battle, and he hunted runaway slaves because it was easier than facing the fact that he had become something he didn't recognize when he looked in the mirror. Pike Morrison's massive frame was hidden behind a fallen log, his shotgun loaded with buckshot that would spread wide enough to bring down multiple targets with a single blast. He was thinking about the resistance they might face. The man they had been tracking was supposed to be dangerous, but Pike had never met a runaway who could stand up to 5 armed white men. Tonight would be no different. Pike had been a slave overseer before joining Colt's crew, a job that had required him to be both physically intimidating and utterly without mercy. He had whipped men and women for the smallest infractions, had separated families without a second thought, and had convinced himself that he was maintaining order in a system that was natural and right. The idea that his former victims might fight back was something he refused to consider. Samuel Cross, the tracker, felt the familiar calm that came before action. He had positioned himself with a clear view of the entire camp, ready to cut off any escape routes. His rifle was trained on the fire, waiting for Colt's signal. Cross was perhaps the most dangerous of the group, not because of his physical strength or his weapons, but because of his complete emotional detachment from what they were about to do. Cross had learned to kill without feeling during the Seminole Wars, where mercy was a luxury that could get you scalped and left for the buzzards. He had carried that coldness with him into civilian life, and it had served him well in his chosen profession. To Cross, the people around that campfire were simply targets to be acquired, no different from the deer he had hunted as a boy, but none of them saw the shadow that moved through the trees above them. Isaiah Freeman had spent the last hour studying each hunter's position, memorizing their locations, calculating angles and distances. From his perch in the ancient oak, he could see the entire battlefield laid out below him like a deadly chess game. The refugees by the fire were the king and queen he had to protect. The slave hunters were the pieces he had to remove from the board. His rifle, a custom Springfield that had been modified by Union armorers specifically for long-range accuracy, was loaded with a .58 caliber Minié ball that could drop a man at 600 yards. At this distance, with these targets, it would be like shooting fish in a barrel. Isaiah had learned to shoot on this very plantation, taught by the master's son who had seen potential in the young slave and had decided to cultivate it. Those early lessons had been about hunting deer and wild boar, but the principles were the same. Patience, precision, and the ability to remain absolutely still for hours at a time. The war had refined those skills into something far deadlier. Isaiah had served as a sniper with the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, the famous colored regiment that had proven black men could fight as well as any white soldiers. His reputation had grown with each successful mission, each impossible shot that had eliminated a Confederate officer or disrupted enemy operations. But Isaiah had learned something during his years of war that separated him from ordinary soldiers. Patience was deadlier than any bullet. He would wait for the perfect moment, when his enemies revealed themselves completely, when there would be no escape and no mercy. The moment came when Colt raised his lantern, preparing to signal the attack. Isaiah's first shot shattered the night like thunder. The bullet took Colt in the chest, spinning him around and sending the lantern flying into the dark water where it hissed and died. The slave hunter leader collapsed without a sound, his eyes wide with shock and confusion. In his final moments, Jeremiah Colt realized that he had become the hunted, and that his hunter was far more skilled than he had ever been. "What the hell?" Pike Morrison started to shout, but his words were cut off by the crack of Isaiah's rifle chambering another round. The sound echoed through the swamp like the voice of judgment itself, and in that instant, the remaining hunters realized they were not dealing with a frightened runaway, but with something far more dangerous. The confidence that had carried them through dozens of successful hunts evaporated like mist in the morning sun. The second shot came 3 seconds later, finding Tommy Briggs as he tried to scramble for better cover. The young hunter pitched forward into the swamp water, his dreams of easy money sinking with him beneath the dark surface. His last thought was of his mother, waiting for him to come home with enough money to save the family farm. Panic erupted among the remaining hunters. Marcus Webb fired wildly into the trees, his muzzle flash revealing his position for a fatal instant. Isaiah's third shot silenced him permanently, the bullet finding its mark with the precision of divine retribution. "Where is he?" Pike Morrison roared, his shotgun sweeping back and forth as he searched for a target he couldn't see. "Where the hell is he?" The massive man's voice cracked with fear, an emotion he had never allowed himself to feel when he was the one holding the whip, the one with all the power. Now, For the first time in his life, Pike Morrison understood what it felt like to be hunted, to be at the mercy of someone who saw him as less than human. Samuel Cross, the tracker, was the only one who understood what was happening. "It's him," he whispered, his voice filled with a terror he had never known. "It's the one we were hunting. He's been hunting us." Cross had seen this kind of precision before, during the Seminole Wars, when enemy warriors had picked off his patrol one by one from positions they couldn't locate. But this was different. This was personal. This wasn't just about military tactics or territorial disputes. This was about justice, and Cross knew that justice had finally come for men like him. The refugees around the campfire had thrown themselves flat at the first gunshot, Martha covering her children with her own body while Samuel tried to shield them all. They could hear the battle raging around them, but in the darkness and mist, they couldn't tell who was fighting whom. Little Thomas whimpered softly, his 8-year-old mind unable to process the violence exploding around their peaceful campfire. Rebecca held her little brother close, whispering prayers she had learned from her grandmother, while David tried to be brave for his family, even as his own heart hammered with terror. Isaiah moved through the trees like a vengeful spirit, relocating after each shot, using the confusion and darkness to his advantage. He had learned this deadly dance on the battlefields of Antietam and Gettysburg, where Confederate sharpshooters had tried to hunt him, just as these men were trying to hunt innocent people seeking freedom. Each shot was calculated not just for accuracy, but for psychological effect. Isaiah wanted the remaining hunters to know they were being stalked, to feel the same terror that their victims had felt. He wanted them to understand, in their final moments, what it meant to be prey. Pike Morrison, desperate and terrified, made the mistake of breaking cover. He charged toward where he thought the shots were coming from, his massive frame crashing through the underbrush like a wounded bear. Isaiah's fourth shot dropped him 20 feet from the refugees' campfire, his shotgun falling harmlessly into the mud. As Pike fell, his last sight was of the family he had come to capture, huddled together in terror around their small fire. For the first time in his life, he saw them not as property but as human beings. A mother protecting her children, a father trying to shield his family, young people whose only crime had been wanting to be free. The realization came too late to save his soul, but it came nonetheless. That left only Samuel Cross. The tracker was the smartest of the group and the most dangerous. He had found cover behind a thick cypress trunk and was waiting, listening, trying to locate his invisible enemy by sound alone. Cross was a veteran of Indian wars and border conflicts. He knew how to hunt men who didn't want to be found. But he had never hunted anyone like Isaiah Freeman. Cross pressed his back against the rough bark of the ancient cypress, his rifle held ready across his chest. His pale eyes swept the darkness, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of where the next shot might come from. He had been in situations like this before, during the brutal campaigns against the Seminoles in the Florida Everglades, where a single mistake meant death by arrow or alligator. The tracker's mind raced through possibilities. The shots had come from different positions, which meant their enemy was mobile, probably moving through the trees above ground level. The accuracy suggested military training, probably Union Army, given the precision and the tactical awareness. But most disturbing of all was the methodical nature of the attack. This wasn't panic or desperation, this was calculated execution. Cross had built his reputation on being able to read sign that other men couldn't see, to follow trails that seemed impossible to track. He could tell you what a man had eaten for breakfast by examining his footprints, could predict where a fugitive would go next by understanding the psychology of fear and desperation. But tonight he was the one being read, being predicted, being hunted by someone who understood the game better than he did. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the gentle lapping of water and the distant call of night birds returning to their interrupted songs. Cross knew his only chance was to wait for his enemy to make a mistake, to reveal himself somehow. But as the minutes ticked by, he began to realize that his opponent was more patient than he was, more disciplined, more deadly. Isaiah knew this too. He also knew that every second he delayed was another second the refugees remained in danger. But rushing would get them all killed. So he did something unexpected. He began to move, not away from Cross, but toward him, circling through the trees with the patience of a predator who had all night to complete his hunt. From his new position, Isaiah could see Cross clearly. The tracker was good. He had chosen excellent cover and was maintaining proper discipline. But he had made one crucial mistake. He was thinking like a hunter when he should have been thinking like prey. Cross was waiting for Isaiah to reveal himself when he should have been trying to escape. Isaiah had learned this lesson on the battlefields of Virginia, where Confederate sharpshooters had tried to hunt him through the ruins of burned-out towns and shell-cratered fields. The ones who survived were the ones who understood that sometimes the best defense was to become the aggressor, to turn the hunt around on the hunter. Moving with infinite care, Isaiah positioned himself for the final shot. He could see Cross's profile now, etched against the faint glow of the distant campfire. The tracker was still scanning the darkness, still waiting for his enemy to make a mistake that would never come. Cross heard the soft sound of a boot on wet earth and spun toward it, firing into the darkness. The muzzle flash lit up his face for an instant, and in that instant Isaiah saw everything he needed to see. The tracker's position, his posture, the exact angle needed for a clean kill. The final shot echoed across the swamp like a judgment from heaven itself. Samuel Cross pitched forward into the dark water, his rifle falling from nerveless fingers. As the life faded from his pale eyes, he finally understood what his victims had felt in their final moments. The helplessness, the terror, the knowledge that death was coming, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Silence fell over the Georgia swamp like a burial shroud. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the earthy scent of moss and stagnant water, creating an atmosphere thick with the weight of sudden death. 5 men who had entered these waters as hunters now lay still beneath the Spanish moss, their weapons scattered and useless in the mud. Isaiah Freeman remained motionless in the trees for a full 10 minutes after the last shot, his rifle trained on the darkness, listening for any sign that more hunters might be approaching. His breathing was controlled, his heartbeat steady, the calm of a man who had danced with death so many times that it had become as natural as walking. The refugees around the campfire remained frozen in terror, unsure whether the shooting was over or if they were about to become the next victims. Martha held her children close, her body shielding them from whatever horror might emerge from the darkness. Samuel kept his arms around his family, ready to fight with his bare hands if necessary to protect them. Only when he was certain the threat had passed did Isaiah begin his descent from the ancient oak that had served as his fortress. His movements were fluid and silent, each step calculated to avoid the slightest sound that might alarm the refugees who still huddled around their dying campfire. As his boots touched the soft earth, Isaiah could hear the whispered prayers and muffled sobs coming from the family he had protected. They had no idea who had saved them, or even if they had truly been saved at all. For all they knew, they had simply witnessed one group of white men kill another, and their own fate remained uncertain. Isaiah approached the campfire slowly, emerging from the mist like a figure from a dream. His rifle was held low but ready, his dark eyes sweeping the perimeter one more time before he allowed himself to relax slightly. The firelight played across his face, revealing the scars and weathered features of a man who had seen too much war, too much death, too much injustice. Martha Washington was the first to spot the figure emerging from the mist. She had been clutching her children close, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, when she saw him, a tall, lean man with skin as dark as her own, carrying a rifle that seemed to be an extension of his very soul. "Samuel," she whispered to her husband, her voice barely audible. "Look." Samuel Washington raised his head and found himself staring into the eyes of the man who had been guiding them north for the past 3 weeks. But this was not the quiet, gentle soul who had shared their meager meals and told stories to their children around previous campfires. This was someone else entirely, someone forged in the fires of war and tempered by the necessity of survival. The transformation was startling. The Isaiah Freeman, who had guided them through safe passages and shared his knowledge of edible plants, was still there, but overlaid with something harder, more dangerous. This was the ghost that Confederate soldiers whispered about in their camps, the sniper who could kill at impossible distances and disappear like smoke. "Mr. Freeman," Rebecca whispered, her young voice trembling with a mixture of fear and awe. Isaiah approached the fire slowly, his rifle held low but ready. His dark eyes swept the perimeter one more time before he allowed himself to relax slightly. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of what had just transpired, but also a gentleness that reminded them of the man who had been protecting them all along. "It's over," he said simply. "They won't be hunting anyone ever again." Little Thomas, only 8 years old, peeked out from behind his mother's protective embrace. His young mind struggled to process what had happened, but he understood that the quiet man who had been telling him stories about freedom had just done something terrible and necessary to keep them safe. "Were those the bad men, Mr. Freeman? The ones who wanted to take us back?" Isaiah knelt beside the fire, setting his rifle within easy reach. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face, highlighting the scars that marked him as a veteran of countless battles. His expression softened as he looked at the child, remembering his own innocence lost so many years ago. "Yes, son, they were the bad men, but they can't hurt you now." Martha studied the man who had saved their lives, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. She had known he was different from the other guides who helped refugees along the Underground Railroad. There was something in his eyes that spoke of experiences beyond her imagination. Now she understood what that something was. The way he held himself, the casual competence with which he handled his weapon, the calm that surrounded him even after taking 5 lives. These were the marks of a professional soldier, someone who had learned to kill efficiently and without hesitation when the situation demanded it. "You're a soldier," she said. Not a question, but a statement of recognition. Isaiah nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the firelight like dark mirrors. "Was a soldier. Still am, I suppose. When the need arises." He gestured toward the darkness where the bodies of the slave hunters lay. "Those men made their living stealing freedom from people like us. Tonight, they paid the price for that choice." The weight of those words settled over the small group like a blanket. These were people who had lived their entire lives under the threat of violence, who had been taught from birth that their lives had no value beyond their usefulness to their masters. To see that violence turned against their oppressors, to witness justice delivered with such swift and terrible efficiency, was both terrifying and liberating. Samuel Washington found his voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "How many were there?" 5, Isaiah replied without emotion. "All dead. We're safe for now, but we need to move. Gunshots carry far in the swamp, and there might be others." As if summoned by his words, the sound of distant voices drifted through the mist. Isaiah's head snapped up, his hand moving instinctively to his rifle. But these voices were different. They carried the cadence of men, calling out in concern rather than aggression, the disciplined tones of soldiers rather than the harsh shouts of bounty hunters. "Hello, the camp!" came a shout from the darkness. "This is Sergeant Mills, 54th Massachusetts Infantry. We heard shooting." Isaiah relaxed slightly, though he kept his rifle ready. The 54th Massachusetts was a colored regiment, one of the first officially recognized African-American units in the Union Army. If they were in the area, it meant the Union lines were closer than he had dared to hope. "Here!" Isaiah called back, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. "Refugees and escort, coming in." The relief in his voice was palpable, and the Washington family felt some of the tension leave their shoulders for the first time in weeks. They were close to safety, close to freedom, close to the end of their long and dangerous journey. Within minutes, a patrol of 6 Union soldiers emerged from the mist, their blue uniforms dark with swamp water and their rifles at the ready. Their leader, a grizzled sergeant with kind eyes and graying hair, took in the scene with the practiced gaze of a veteran who had seen too much war to be surprised by anything. "Sergeant Mills," the man introduced himself, then paused as his eyes fell on Isaiah's rifle. The weapon was distinctive, longer than standard infantry rifles, with a telescopic sight that marked it as a sniper's tool. Recognition dawned in the sergeant's eyes. "Wait a minute. I know that weapon. You're Freeman, aren't you? The ghost." Isaiah stood slowly, suddenly aware that his reputation had preceded him even into these remote swamps. The weight of legend was something he had never grown comfortable with, preferring to do his work quietly and without fanfare. "I am." The soldiers around Sergeant Mills straightened with obvious respect. Even in the dim firelight, Isaiah could see the awe in their faces. These men had heard the stories, tales of the Union sniper who could kill Confederate officers at impossible distances, who had turned the tide of battles with a single perfectly placed shot. "Sir," Sergeant Mills said, his voice filled with genuine reverence, "it's an honor. We've been looking for you for weeks. Command wants to debrief you about Confederate positions in this sector." The sergeant was a career soldier who had served in the regular army before the war, and he had seen enough combat to recognize a true warrior when he met one. But there was something more than professional respect in his voice. There was the kind of awe reserved for men who had become legends in their own time. Isaiah glanced at the refugee family, who were watching this exchange with growing hope and confusion. They had known their guide was special, but they were only now beginning to understand just how special he was. "These people need to reach safety first, Sergeant. They've been through enough." The simple statement revealed everything about Isaiah's character. Despite his fearsome reputation, despite the fact that Union commanders were actively seeking him out, his first concern was for the civilians under his protection. This was not the behavior of a man who had been corrupted by war, but of someone who had found his true purpose in protecting the innocent. "Of course, sir. We've got a camp about 2 miles north, right on the edge of Union territory. These folks will be safe there, and we can get them passage north to freedom." Sergeant Mills turned to his men, issuing quiet orders that would ensure the Washington family's safe passage to the Union lines. The soldiers moved with the efficiency of a well-trained unit, but Isaiah could see the excitement in their eyes. They were in the presence of a living legend, and they knew it. As the soldiers began to help the Washington family gather their meager possessions, young David tugged on Isaiah's sleeve. The boy had been quiet throughout the ordeal, but now his curiosity overcame his fear. "Mr. Freeman, are you really famous?" Isaiah knelt down to the boy's level, his stern expression softening as it always did when he spoke to children. Despite everything he had seen and done, he still believed in the possibility of innocence, still hoped that the next generation might grow up in a world where such violence was unnecessary. "I'm just a man who learned to shoot straight, son. The important thing is that you and your family are going to be free. That's what matters." But even as he spoke the words, Isaiah knew they weren't entirely true. He had become something more than just a man with a rifle. He had become a symbol, a representation of what freed slaves could accomplish when given the chance to fight for their own liberation. Martha Washington approached him as the soldiers prepared to escort them to safety. Her eyes were bright, with tears of gratitude, but also with a deeper understanding of what this man had sacrificed to protect people like her family. "Mr. Freeman, I don't know how to thank you. You saved our lives tonight." Isaiah stood, shouldering his rifle with the casual ease of long practice. "You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Washington. Helping people find freedom. That's what I was born to do. The war just gave me different tools to do it with." The truth of that statement resonated through the small group. Isaiah Freeman had not been made by the war. He had been revealed by it. The courage, the skill, the unwavering commitment to justice had always been there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. As the group prepared to leave the swamp, Isaiah took one last look at the battlefield where 5 slave hunters had met their end. He felt no satisfaction in their deaths, only a grim acknowledgement that justice had been served. These men had chosen to make their living by stealing the freedom of others, and in the end, that choice had cost them everything. The mist was beginning to lift as dawn approached, and through the clearing air, Isaiah could see the first hints of sunlight filtering through the cypress canopy. It seemed fitting somehow. Darkness giving way to light, death giving way to hope. But even as they walked toward safety, Isaiah knew that the war was far from over. There would be more battles to fight, more lives to protect, more hunters who would need to be hunted. The rifle on his shoulder would speak again before this conflict ended. 3 months later, the story of what happened in the Georgia swamp had spread through both Union and Confederate camps like wildfire. In the Union ranks, Isaiah Freeman had become more than just a legendary sniper. He was a symbol of what freed slaves could accomplish when given the chance to fight for their own liberation. Confederate soldiers whispered his name in the darkness, knowing that the ghost could be watching from any tree line, any rooftop, any shadow. The tale had grown in the telling, as such stories always do. Some versions had Isaiah killing a dozen slave hunters single-handedly. Others claimed he had rescued an entire wagon train of refugees. But the core truth remained unchanged. A man who had been born into slavery had become one of the most feared warriors in the Union Army. But the story that mattered most was being told around a different kind of campfire, in a different kind of place entirely. The Washington family had made it safely to a refugee camp in Pennsylvania, where they were learning to read and write in preparation for their new lives as free citizens. It was there, on a cold December evening, that Martha Washington sat with a group of newly arrived refugees, sharing the tale of their escape through the Georgia swamps. The refugee camp was a sprawling collection of tents and temporary buildings that housed hundreds of former slaves who had made the dangerous journey north to freedom. It was a place of hope and hardship, where people who had been treated as property learned to think of themselves as human beings with rights and dignity. "He appeared out of nowhere," Martha told them, her voice carrying the weight of absolute truth, like an angel of vengeance sent by the Lord himself. 5 armed men hunting us like animals, and he stopped them all with nothing but his rifle and his courage. The refugees listened with rapt attention, their eyes wide with wonder and hope. These were people who had known only oppression and fear for most of their lives, and the idea that one of their own could stand against their oppressors with such devastating effectiveness filled them with something they had rarely dared to feel: pride. Among the listeners was an elderly man named Josiah, who had arrived at the camp just days before. His back still bore the scars of the whip, and his eyes held the haunted look of someone who had seen too much cruelty. But as he listened to Martha's story, something changed in his expression. What happened to him? Josiah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "This ghost, where is he now?" Martha smiled, though her eyes held a touch of sadness. "Still fighting, I imagine, still protecting people like us. The soldiers said he was too valuable to the war effort to stay in one place for long." She was right. At that very moment, Isaiah Freeman was positioned in a church bell tower outside Atlanta, his rifle trained on a Confederate supply depot 2 miles away. He had been watching the facility for 3 days, learning the patterns of the guards, calculating wind speed and bullet drop, preparing for a shot that would disrupt Confederate supply lines for weeks. The bell tower was cramped and cold, but it offered an excellent view of the target area. Isaiah had made himself as comfortable as possible, knowing that he might have to wait for hours or even days for the perfect opportunity. Patience was still his greatest weapon, more valuable than any rifle or scope. But even as he focused on his military objectives, Isaiah's mind often drifted back to that night in the swamp. Not to the violence or the killing, but to the moment when little Thomas had asked if he was famous. The boy's innocent question had forced Isaiah to confront a truth he had been avoiding. He was becoming something larger than himself, a symbol that carried weight far beyond his individual actions. The responsibility of that symbolism weighed heavily on his shoulders. Every shot he took, every mission he completed, every Confederate officer he eliminated, it all contributed to a legend that was inspiring enslaved people across the South to believe that freedom was not just a dream, but an achievable reality. Back in Pennsylvania, Rebecca Washington had become something of a celebrity herself among the refugee children. She would gather them around and tell them about the night the ghost saved her family, her young voice painting vivid pictures of courage and justice triumphing over evil. "He moved through the trees like smoke," she would say, her eyes bright with the memory. "And when those bad men tried to hurt us, his rifle spoke like thunder, and they couldn't hurt anyone ever again." The children would gasp and cheer, their imaginations fired by tales of a hero who looked like them, who had come from the same circumstances they had escaped. For many of them, Isaiah Freeman represented the first positive image of black masculinity they had ever encountered, a man who was not broken by slavery, but strengthened by the fight against it. Rebecca had started writing down these stories, using the reading and writing skills she was learning in the camp's makeshift school. Her teacher, a white woman from Boston who had come south to help educate the refugees, encouraged her to continue. "These stories are important," the teacher told her. "They show that heroes come in all colors and that freedom is worth fighting for." Samuel Washington had found work in a Philadelphia shipyard where his natural mechanical aptitude had quickly earned him the respect of his supervisors. During lunch breaks, he would often find himself surrounded by other workers, both black and white, who wanted to hear about his encounter with the legendary sniper. "You really met him?" they would ask. "The ghost, what was he like?" Samuel would pause in his work, his hands still for a moment as he remembered. He was like freedom itself had taken human form. Quiet when he needed to be, deadly when he had to be, but always, always protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. These stories, told and retold across the North, began to take on a life of their own. Isaiah Freeman became more than a man. He became a myth, a legend that embodied the hopes and dreams of an entire people fighting for their liberation. Union recruiters found that mentioning his name could inspire dozens of black men to enlist, eager to serve alongside the legendary ghost. But perhaps the most important story was the one that never got told in the history books. On a quiet Sunday morning in April 1864, a young Confederate deserter named Billy Hawkins stumbled into a Union camp in Tennessee, half dead from hunger and exposure. He had been running for 3 days, ever since he had witnessed something that shattered his worldview completely. Billy had been part of a Confederate patrol that had cornered a group of escaped slaves in a barn outside Nashville. The plan had been simple: surround the building, force the fugitives out, and return them to their owners for the bounty money. It was the kind of operation Confederate soldiers had carried out hundreds of times before, but this time they had been watched. Isaiah Freeman had been in the area on a reconnaissance mission when he spotted the Confederate patrol moving toward the barn. Inside that building were 12 people, men, women, and children, who had risked everything for a chance at freedom. Isaiah knew he couldn't let them be recaptured. What followed was a masterclass in precision warfare. From a position nearly 800 yards away, Isaiah had systematically eliminated the Confederate patrol with shots so accurate and so perfectly timed that the survivors, including Billy Hawkins, were convinced they were under attack by an entire company of Union sharpshooters. Billy had watched in terror and awe as his companions fell one by one to an invisible enemy whose bullets seemed to come from the very air itself. When the shooting stopped, he had fled into the woods, leaving behind his rifle, his uniform, and his belief in the cause he had been fighting for. "I seen what one man can do when he's fighting for something righteous," Billy told the Union officers who debriefed him, "and I seen what happens to folks who try to stop him. I don't want no part of that war no more." Billy's testimony, along with dozens of similar accounts from Confederate deserters, painted a picture of Isaiah Freeman that went beyond mere military effectiveness. He had become a force of nature, a one-man army whose very presence on the battlefield could demoralize entire enemy units. The psychological impact of the ghost legend was perhaps more valuable than his actual military contributions. Confederate soldiers began to see snipers in every shadow, to hear the whisper of death in every rustling leaf. The knowledge that Isaiah Freeman was somewhere out there watching, waiting, ready to deliver justice with a single perfectly placed shot, haunted their dreams and undermined their morale. But the true measure of Isaiah's impact wasn't found in military reports or newspaper accounts. It was found in the faces of the people he had saved, the families he had protected, the children who grew up free because he had stood between them and those who would have enslaved them. As the war drew toward its inevitable conclusion, Isaiah Freeman continued to fight, continued to protect, continued to embody the hope of a people who had waited centuries for their moment of liberation. His rifle spoke justice across a dozen more battlefields, and his legend grew with each perfectly placed shot. But on quiet nights, when the fighting was done and the camps were still, Isaiah would sometimes think back to that family around the campfire in the Georgia swamp. He would remember little Thomas asking if he was famous, and Martha Washington's tears of gratitude, and Rebecca's wide-eyed wonder at seeing evil defeated by righteousness. Those memories reminded him why he fought, not for glory or recognition, but for the simple, profound truth that every human being deserved to be free. And as long as there were people who needed protection, as long as there were hunters who preyed on the innocent, the ghost would be there, watching from the shadows, ready to ensure that justice was served. The slave hunters had thought they were tracking easy prey that night in the swamp. Instead, they had walked into the crosshairs of history itself, and their deaths had become part of a larger story, the story of a people's fight for freedom, and the man who had become the deadly guardian of their dreams. In the end, that was Isaiah Freeman's true legacy, not the number of enemies he had killed, but the number of souls he had set free. This story reminds us that sometimes those who appear most vulnerable possess the greatest strength. Isaiah Freeman's transformation from hunted to hunter represents more than just a reversal of fortune. It embodies the power of justice when wielded by those who truly understand oppression. In our modern world, we still face hunters of different kinds. Those who prey on the vulnerable, who profit from others' suffering, who believe that might makes right. The lesson of the Georgia swamp remains relevant. Underestimate the oppressed at your own peril, for history has shown us time and again that the arc of justice, though long, bends toward freedom. The Washington family's journey from slavery to freedom, protected by a man who had transformed his own pain into purpose, speaks to the enduring power of hope and the importance of those who choose to stand guard over the dreams of others. Isaiah Freeman became more than a sniper. He became a symbol of what is possible when skill, courage, and moral clarity combine in service of justice. If this story of courage, justice, and unexpected heroism moved you, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this tale of the ghost who turned the tables on evil itself, and let us know in the comments what modern-day hunters do you think need to be reminded that their prey might be more dangerous than they appear. Until next time, remember, the most dangerous person in any room is often the one who has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for.